Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. This is episode 137 of the Round Table. And I have joined again with me Keith Preston, Florian, and Alek. Alek, can you mute yourself, please? There we go. So today's episode is on education, or rather the lack thereof. So I'm going to just begin with my brief thoughts on why we don't actually have an education system in the United States, or for that matter, most of the world. We do not have an education system in the US, or for most of the world for that matter. There are two problems in modern education: the content of what is taught and the way in which is taught. In the Western tradition, education has always meant the ability to think and reason clearly. That is, education teaches one how to think, not what to think. Indoctrination teaches one what to think. Thinking moves in two directions, forwards and backwards. One reasons in a forward motion when one starts with a premise and reasons to a conclusion. A hypothetical syllogism is an example of this form of reasoning. We start with what we know and then extrapolate to some point. Thinking moves in a backwards direction when one looks at a fact and then constructs a chain of events that must have brought it about. This is what a coroner or a forensics investigator does. To ascertain the time and cause of death, the coroner looks at the cadaver, looking at the signs of death, and reasons backwards to the probable chain of events that led to the death. Indoctrination is instructing the student on what to think rather than how to think. Outside of niche fields of study such as logic, forensics, whatever education you have to read the black box of a crashed airplane, nobody is taught to reason this way at all anymore. In earlier times, this stuff was taught in high school. The way teaching occurs is operant conditioning, using symbols and correction methods. This is not education, this is propaganda. Proper education is rooted in building an emotional connection with the student, the goal of which is to generate inside the conscious mind of the student the desired ideas and the relations between these ideas. In order to do this, the teacher must first know how to think and the nature of the material being taught. The teacher views his mind and the mind of his student as a brain room, with a fully furnished brain room as the correct ideas and correct associations of ideas. This is a metaphor for a well-constructed and operating consciousness. The goal is to form an image within the student's inner consciousness and from there to relate these objects of thought to one another. That this is not done is in large part because we live in a materialist age where the mind is not seen as something that even exists. ADD and ADHD are labels given to students who fail to properly respond to this mechanical form of education. Praxis as operant conditioning. The method is the problem, not the student, but we cannot say that. In short, the content of education is non-existent and the mechanism is defective. Keith.
Yeah. Well, I think that a problem with education as it's practiced in the United States is increasingly the content has had to be dumbed down in order to uh, accommodate the principle of universal education. You have this idea that everybody should get as much education as possible. Everyone should stay in school as long as they can, and there's no concern for the variations in ability, variations in motivation, variations in interest. So even at the K through 12 level, before you even get into higher education, you have students that are borderline retarded being taught algebra and stuff like that. That's of no relevance to anything practical. Um, there's a lot that could be said about problems with K through 12 education, but at the university level, which is what I have more experience with, it's a very similar situation because, um, first of all, the norm for several decades at least has been that everybody should go to college. There's this idea that everybody should have a university education. So in order to get as many people into the university system as possible, they have to adjust the curriculum to make it universally acceptable. And what that means in practice is that higher education in the United States has become basically just a glorified high school, or certainly undergrad education. If you go to any university type institution today, or community college, and this transcends a lot of the differences. This transcends the difference between public and private and state schools and religious schools and all of that. If you go to most universities or colleges in the United States today, what you're going to is a glorified high school. It's like instead of K through 12, we now have K through 16. And increasingly, the curriculum in higher education is taught on a high school level. And sometimes it's taught on a middle school level. And a lot of the curriculum is simply make work. It's just stuff to keep students busy and make it look like they're actually doing something. One thing that I think has been a major detriment is distance education or distance learning, which is online education, because what that has done is create a system of diploma mills where you have all these supposed online universities that where people are getting university degrees, even graduate degrees, even PhDs through things like participating on discussion boards and that it's like it's almost like education is being conducted via Facebook or something like that. And the quality of education can't be maintained when it's structured that way. And with the idea of just trying to get as many people into college as possible, you have to dumb the curriculum down in order to the lowest common denominator to accommodate the people with the lowest level of ability. For instance, if you look at different schools and their acceptance rate, it used to be it was a big deal to get accepted into college. Increasingly, more and more colleges accept virtually anybody who applies and is capable of paying the tuition. For instance, my alma mater at one point um, had an acceptance rate of about 50%. Now it's something like 90%. There are other four-year universities that have a pretty much a 100% acceptance rate. That's certainly true with the community colleges. The community colleges have always been glorified high schools. They always accepted all comers, and maybe that's good. Maybe there's a place for that. But at the university level, increasingly, what you see because of this is universities becoming glorified high schools. Now, that's not to say everything that's done at the university level is wrong or incompetent or unworthy. In a lot of fields, like the technologies, the hard sciences, some of these kinds of disciplines, there's still a lot of good work going on in the university system. But increasingly, though, undergrad education, when it comes to all the prerequisites and degree programs and things like that, a lot of this stuff is increasingly just make work or made up degrees just to get as many people as possible through the university system. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of money in this. The way that colleges and universities make money, one of the ways is through students obviously paying to attend. So what they do is they encourage the students to take out student loans, run up tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in personal debt that's not dischargeable in bankruptcy. So we're talking about what amounts to indentured servitude. Right? Students are encouraged to run up all this debt in order to get a degree in whatever ethnic studies or basket weaving or finger painting or whatever. Now that's not all that goes on in universities. I don't want to paint the worst possible picture in a way that's exaggerated, but increasingly you do see students getting largely worthless degrees at an increasingly higher cost, and in a way that really doesn't provide them with much in the way of education. It's really just sort of like a diploma mill, correspondence school, or glorified high school type of education.
All right, Alek.
Hello, can everybody see and hear me?
Yes,
Am I coming through clearly?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so first of all, I want to say that this topic is a personal topic for me, as I founded academic composition in 2009. That my business model is helping people cheat for college. And I've known Florian and Keith for the better part of the decade. And the reality is that we're not actually committing any kind of a moral transgression here. The academic system is fundamentally corrupt from start to finish. And as John Dewey argued that there should be democratization of knowledge, but what it translates to is a complete disaster. That people are getting degrees who are basically illiterate, producing material that cannot pass muster anything, period. And we help these people get ahead in life. So I have to ask, what is the point of this? As Horace Mann, Senator Horace Mann, who founded the system of education, famously said that there's got to be schools got to be run like a factory, and that's what's going on. There's regimentation, there is conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning, and I wonder what is the public goal? If we're undermining the public goal, what are we losing? What are we actually doing that harms society? What is the reason why people should not cheat through college? What value does college education actually offer that they could not find elsewhere? So that's all I have for now.
All right, Florian.
Yeah, good points. Keith mentioned that content that you teach students has to be dumbed down. Can you hear me? You can, right?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Great. Yeah. Keith said that content has to be dumbed down to accommodate universal education, and there's a little concern for individual ability for the student. One thing that reminds me of is you always have people in society that are not really capable of studying, or they don't have a high enough IQ, or otherwise are impeded. And in the past, those people still had the ability to to get a menial job, right? And the problem is that there was like a silent agreement between business and government that business would cover that kind of slack in society, and business has kind of like canceled that contract over time, because now AI is taking away all those easy busy work positions, right? Which leaves society to deal with people that are basically unemployable, and will never that problem will ever get worse in the future with more and more AI, right? So then you get, and as I said before, you can say, I don't care about those people, but if you have 10 cities propping up all over the country, then it is a problem, right? It denigrates societal cohesion, and there's crime and all the negative adverse effects that come with it. That's a problem we need to solve somehow. And one way that's getting solved is probably at least by proposing universal basic income. So that may come in the future, and I'm not sure how we may be able to solve that via education. Then the point that since the last 20 to 30 years, everybody should go to college, and that meant, of course, you have to adjust the curriculum downwards. That may also be different in the future via the advent of AI. AI can automate individually different ways of learning, right? So basically, AI could have like some algebra lesson and adjust it for different skill levels for each student. But that also brings another danger with it, which is selection, right? I read about some high schools in New York City that were starting to do that 10 years ago. They will look at the DNA of the students they admit. They get a DNA test, and then they will look whether those students have any promising mutations that make them supposedly smarter than other students. And there's always difficult to point at like a multi-genetic trait like intelligence that's not even clearly defined without going into genetics. But you can basically look at people that are successful, look at their DNA. We have that now more and more. And then you have some AI running and determining, oh, those mutations should be there. And then we admit the students, or those students pay less, whereas others pay more, and so on, right? So there's a problem in selection with the future of education. And then with the amount of money that's in the process, and because students can get unlimited loans, basically, they are basically guaranteed by government, but the students have to basically shoulder that loan and pay it back. And those students that get like underwater basket weaving degrees, as Keith mentioned, those aren't able to pay it really back. And I want to point out another, Aaron Clarey wrote in the book Worthless, where he basically had his students list their majors, like with sociology, women's studies, accounting, journalism, psychology, education, and then what they would buy with money, which is booze, beer, flat screen TV, sushi, jewelry, computer, clothing, movies, right? And gasoline also, and all the kind of stuff. So there's an aspect that not only is society dumbed down, but also education is not giving people the skills they need to produce something that is in high demand in society. And one way of that changing, that was also an idea that came up like 10 years ago. You had some colleges that would not demand any tuition from students, but the students had to pay it back as soon as they got a job. So when you get a job, you pay like 10% of your salary back per year to the university, and that of course forces universities to give people education in an in-demand skill, right? Because the universities want to get paid. Now that's a discussion that goes into an area where we say education is important for practical skill set, for getting students into the trades. The entire other part is you do need some students that do liberal arts studies. You do need people that actually are going into management and are actually regulating society in a way. That's how society works, right? I mean, I can always rail against managerialism, but maybe the sad truth of the matter is that we do need some people that are in academia and developing thought mindset models and all that kind of stuff. In fact, it's a mistake for conservatives when they say, send your kids to trades, don't bother with universities. Yeah, but if the universities are all occupied by your ideological opponents, then you will have problem getting any political representation later on, right? But that's basically another problem of education that has been mostly dominated by liberal arts and left-wing political people. So and conservatives sometimes try to give up and say we do only trades, and we can cut off the electricity from the useless social science students. But in the end, those students sit on important positions in society and will create policies that may be adversary to people that aren't represented in those institutions.
Yes. So there's a lot to unpack here, but let's go back to the first point that I made about learning how to think. So there's been this discussion in the United States between, quote, good schools, like those that have money to pay for good teachers, and then bad schools. And the left liberals in the left have weaponized this to say that, minorities don't get to go to good schools, so on and so on. But I'm not talking about the bad schools. I'm talking about the good schools. Okay, so let's look at like Cambridge in the UK or Yale in the United States, right? Nobody who graduates from these institutions understands what it is, really, in an applied sense, how to reason forward from a premise to a conclusion, which in the study in Scarlet, that's called synthetic reasoning by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And then even fewer looking at an object and then reasoning backwards, which is called analytical reasoning in the study in Scarlet. And the thing is, this is just never anything anybody would have considered as an education. If you look at, like, say, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, university wonks who in the 20s and 30s grew up in the British academic system, they had a breadth and width of knowledge, not just of discrete facts, but the ability to orient and combine these facts that nobody living today has. I don't know anybody who could write something like the Lord of the Rings and relate all these different pieces together, or someone who could write a detective series like Arthur Conan Doyle with Sherlock Holmes. There's a level of and then also practical problem solving. So if you look at the American settlement of the frontier or the British Empire in the 19th century, a lot of these men who were educated, right? So the British showed up in the officer corps, and then for the United States, we had a much broader set of education. You had people who could practically solve problems as they developed on the fly. And that used to be the American hallmark. That's essentially gone now. I mean, some people can sort of do it, But even that's a far cry from, what we had in the early 19th century in the United States. So what I'm arguing is even the good schools, quote unquote, that have the money and the teachers, do not teach people how to think. Even then, I mean, we've all had, because let's face it, if you look at the demographics in the United States, those who vote liberal and have liberal beliefs are those that come from the higher echelons of education. And all of us in this group chat have talked to liberals before, and they clearly lack the reasoning skills that their education ought to have given them. And they make this elementary mistake as well, that the belief sets of what are my cultural norms and what are good, everybody else has. So just as an example, like during the Cold War, the American operators knew that the Soviets were highly educated. They could solve problems. They could, make these plans for intrigues and whatnot. And that, they might have had a different worldview and a different philosophy, but what was common between the two, between, say, a CIA and KGB agent, was they both had a similar education about how things actually work. And they were just operating from different pre-rational assumptions based on their political ideology. And so what I'm arguing is even that the good schools don't really teach education. Now, there's a broader sense in which education also can include acculturation. So as I've said before on this channel, the liberal arts education with regards to the knowledge of history and philosophy and civics and ethics were all considered essential for the political life going as far back as ancient Greece. And we have a collapse of the political in this country because that information is not being communicated. And the founding fathers knew that you needed to have that kind of education in order to have a population able to engage in civic life. And that's just gone as well. And even what we might call the raw materials of education, basic facts about history, basic facts about, the most elementary parts of science, basic facts about ethics, basic facts, that's not being taught either. So reasoning correctly, while important, you still have to reason about things. And if you don't have a correct understanding of the things that you're relating to one another, then that doesn't work either. And, again, if you get a logic degree in a philosophy department, that will teach you how to reason correctly, but that used to be taught in high school to everybody. Now it's only a niche study for people in those departments. And as Keith had already said, a lot of this is for the effort of making money, right? You want these people to be giving you money to the school to generate a profit. It's a business. And then I think you can also say that liberals sort of view this as a pipeline for getting what they want out of society, right? Those higher educated people tend to identify as liberals, which just is another way of saying indoctrination. A higher education shouldn't necessarily make you think that way, especially, when you apply the reasoning elements to discrete political problems. Keith.
Yeah, well, a problem related to that is the lack of critical thinking skills that you see not only among students, but just in society at large. Um, it's often commonplace nowadays for commentators, pundits, to be disdainful of the fact that many people believe in conspiracy theories. And I do see that. For example, I get students who turn in papers talking about the Illuminati and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, this kind of thinking becomes commonplace when people don't have the ability to engage in critical thinking. They don't know what it means, as Todd was saying, to make a reasoned argument or to apply, ordinary standards of evidence, or what standards of evidence would even be. For example, there's the concept of Occam's razor, the idea that, the most simple and probable explanation is usually the correct explanation for a particular phenomena. It's interesting because an experiment that I have done before is I'll either take papers that students of mine have given me, or sometimes I'll just take conversations from social media like Twitter, X, or whatever, and Facebook, and I'll run it through artificial intelligence systems and say, okay, point out the logical fallacies in this conversation or in this paper, and they'll come up, one thing after another. Well, so and so doesn't, use evidence, or so and so makes an unfounded assertion, or so and so makes a conclusion that doesn't follow from the premises. And I think what Todd is getting at is that most people would not even know what that means. Like most people, if you ask them, what does it mean? What does it mean to be a critical thinker? They would probably say, well, it means you criticize things, right? Like it means you criticize, somebody's new suit or whatever. They don't like it, or you criticize the way this team played in a game or something. So most people don't really even know what critical thinking is. They don't understand the rules of logic. And you see that with just the level of ignorance that exists in ordinary society among people in ordinary life. Like some of my favorite videos, online videos, are these videos where somebody will put a microphone on some person in the street and ask them just a very basic question, like, how many states are there in the United States? Or what country did America originally separate from and become independent of? Or, and increasingly you find people in ordinary life that can't answer these basic questions. And I know that those aren't just being selective, because I come across that in the academic world on probably 30 or 40 occasions. I have asked a group of undergrads, maybe 40 students in a classroom, to explain what a Protestant is. And they have no clue. No one in the room will have a clue as to what a Protestant is. And even though the majority of them are Protestants, they don't know, like I'll say, is anyone here a Baptist? Is anyone an Episcopalian? Is anyone a Lutheran? And I've done things like explain who Martin Luther, the reformer, was, and they'll think I'm talking about Martin Luther King. And this is just basic knowledge. This isn't something that you have to be an expert in a particular field to be able to understand. And it's like this, not just about historical things, but about all kinds of things. For instance, I'll ask students questions like, what century did World War II happen in? What century did the Civil War happen in? They have no clue. They don't even know how to calculate different centuries. They barely know that this is the 21st century. And somewhere along the line, somebody has seriously failed a lot of these students. Because if you're a university student and you don't know, for example, the significance of the year 1776 to American culture, then something is wrong somewhere with the education you received. And again, I see this all over the place. I've taught in different types of schools. I've taught in community colleges. I've taught at HBCUs. I've taught in state universities. I've dealt with students who were attending private universities, as well as these online degree mills. I've dealt with students that were attending these religious schools, and this problem exists everywhere. Just basic ignorance or basic illiteracy in many disciplines, or ordinary areas of life, as well as low literacy skills. I've gotten papers over the years from students that were written on maybe a fourth grade level. I've gotten students who would do things like just cut and paste a Wikipedia article onto a Word doc and call it a paper. What we see is that whoever is teaching these students is incompetent. That they don't have basic knowledge, they don't have basic academic skills. I've dealt with university students who are freshman level students who've never had to write a paper before. And as far as using, say, academic citation styles like Chicago and APA, they have no clue what any of that is. They've never heard of it. And increasingly in various lines of work I'm in, I'm seeing students who can't even write an email. They they write in text message language. They spell U, YOU. They spell it with just the letter U and that kind of stuff. So what we're seeing is a serious regression in terms of overall level of competence when it comes to basic literacy and basic knowledge. For instance, my grandmother, who went to school in the 1910s, 1920s, and only had an eighth grade education, could certainly write and spell and speak and articulate better than people I know today who've been through a 4-year university program.
Yeah, Alek.
Hello.
Yes,
So,
we got you.
so I'm going to reference John Taylor Gatto. And as a professional educator himself, he said that he teaches confusion constantly. That there is nothing in the curriculum that he teaches as a public school teacher that makes sense. There is no coherence, there is no logical reasoning behind it. At the start, you were saying that to be truly educated, you must be able to think critically and logically. But where do you have that? Well, I've had that experience. As I was a philosophy student, I learned symbolic logic. I learned to analyze arguments in the newspaper, in a scholarly journal. That's what my professors expected of me. And I was fortunate enough to have been educated by professors who taught small classrooms. Most university students do not have that experience. Most university students are facing a teaching assistant in a crowded auditorium where there is very little individual attention, where there is very little incentive for them to learn anything. If anything, what they do have an incentive to do is to memorize things so they can pass the exam. And that's why John Taylor Gatto says that he teaches confusion. He teaches people to memorize things. He grades people on acting like robots. So if that is the case, then why are we surprised that ChatGPT and Grok and all these other AI systems are taking away our jobs? Is it not the case that the system of education has been teaching us to act like robots? Very little creativity or intuition, very little critical thinking, very little qualia, to borrow John Searle's term in the Chinese room experiment. In fact, John Searle wrote a wonderful philosophy essay that I still remember, the Chinese room experiment by John Searle. I highly recommend that everybody here looks it up. And the idea is simple. Imagine that John Searle, an American philosophy professor from Irvine, California, that he goes to a Chinese room and he is asked a question in Chinese. And then somebody tells him exactly how to say something, how to answer the question. That he is performing an action that resembles competence in the Chinese language, but there's no qualia going on. There is no phenomenological experience. So can we say that John Searle speaks Chinese? No, that's his point. He's imitating an act. And then, by the way, the Turing test is what we call, is what a machine must pass to appear like a human. So ChatGPT is such a popular program because it acts like a human. It passes the Turing test. But there is no quality. There is no phenomenology. There is no subjective experience. That's really making it authentic. And that is the problem. That we're machines. We're teaching people to be like machines. And the education system is a machine. In the tradition of Horace Mann and John Taylor Gatto, that it's a factory. So I have to ask again, if you have to go to school to learn to act like a robot, why don't we skip all this? Why don't we just train AI to do whatever it is that one supposedly must do? So that is my argument for why the system of education has very little merit. It's not entirely helpful for society, maybe not even at all. And I believe that it needs to be dispensed with and done away with. And the sooner the better.
Agreed. Florian.
Yeah, I see two big problems. Well, one of the biggest problems is branding and marketing, right? So if you think about what Edward Bernays did for Kellogg's cornflakes, he basically inculcated the image in people's minds, in the American mind, that a healthy breakfast has to have cornflakes or any similar stuff. And Kellogg's, of course, sold those cornflakes. So and you see that in the movie Idiocracy in a way. where people suffer from starvation because they fertilize their grain with Brondo, which is basically something like Sprite or Mountain Dew, because Brondo has electrolytes. Brondo is what plants crave. And so, if you think about it, it's funny, but in a way, yeah, cornflakes are important for a healthy breakfast. Why? Nobody has asked why that is, right? People just adhere to that, and that is even stronger nowadays with the notion of politics being part, like as a team sports, right? So people basically like to adhere to a certain message, and they adhere to the message of their team, and it's all branding. There's no desire to teach people really or to educate people. People just take whatever society tells them, and that's also what Keith mentioned when people have a moderators on TV have a disdain for people that engage in conspiracy theories, right? Even though there may be something to them, not every conspiracy theory is bonkers. And so you could say, well, this is just an American problem, right? This is just something that came up in America. There's a lot of and branding and marketing has a lot of effect on people. So people just engage in marketing messages and not free thinking. But this happens in Germany as well. I remember I just saw a podcast with a German, with a left wing podcaster who believed that Hitler was evil and fascist and everything, and then the hypothesis was that Hitler had left wing theories, and he was completely aghast, even though he had a a history professor there, Götz Ali, who basically told him that Hitler adopted several left wing policies, and he wasn't even able to follow with that. It was completely surprising for him. So this team sports metaphor also has basically taken root in all of the Western world. This guy was 40 years old, so he basically went to school after I went to school, and somewhere in the 90s, the whole climate shifted a little bit stronger towards this left-right sports team mentality, I think, and branding has a big role in that. The second thing, if you look at the Turing test, which has been held up as an important landmark to see whether AI really thinking like human, and back then when the Turing test came up as a benchmark, right? And to recapitulate, the Turing test basically means you're talking to an AI bot and you think you're talking to a human. If that happens, the Turing test has been passed. The problem is with that is, first of all, AI in 2015 wasn't, you could recognize it was AI, and so it was a cool advantage or cool advance when you could now all of a sudden around 2020, 2021, you had AI bots that you couldn't tell they were AI bots anymore. But besides that, we should just regard it as that benchmark and not like some larger wisdom. I think that Turing lived in a world, Alan Turing, who basically coined the Turing test. Alan Turing lived in a time in the 1930s, 1940s, which was incredibly insecure worldwide. There were wars going on, and he led the team that deciphered the Enigma machines from the Germans, right? So he was a genius when it comes to breaking code. And so it makes sense that he came up with some rules for AI. But we also have to see that this is a guy who, this is basically, Turing test made sense back in the 1940s and 50s. But this may not be a good role model for how we should make AI or how we should base education on for the modern times. I think, branding and using outdated paradigms for detecting whether education is worthwhile, I think those are the two biggest problems that we face.
Yeah, so we could even go. Keith brought up a good point that the students who get to college, university, that lack some of these basic skills, it's the fault of the teachers, right? They should have been taught by somebody along the way what happened, how to do these basic things that you should be expected to do in a university or college setting. And so this isn't about the students, it's about the teachers. But the other thing that I wanted to point out, though, because this ties into with what Keith said, when I went to the college from 2006 to 2010, one of the things that was already happening, and I thought this was bonkers, right, was everybody was, the teachers, right? They were okay with just chucking out, rote memorization. I used to argue with them. I'm like, how can you teach history without rote memorization? Reasoning is relating symbols to symbols. But before you can relate symbols to symbols, you have to be given the symbols to relate. Now, in the case of the historical profession, that would be dates, places, and names. That would be different for another profession, like, say, chemistry. But the thing is, you have to just be given the symbols. But what a good teacher will do is they'll say this, look, we're just going to give you these things. These are true up to a point. As we get into the class, we'll realize that maybe it's not quite so simple as all that, but we've got to start somewhere, and here's the symbols. Now let's start remembering those symbols, and then we'll move on with this process. You have at all levels of this earlier education, from like K through 12 through high school and all that, there's no infusion of symbols. I know that history has been something that I've been near and dear to my heart, and people just don't. They traditionally think it's boring. Now, obviously, I don't know how you could think that history is anything but boring. So that must be what's being said about the teachers and how they deliver the message. And if you're just taught to hate yourself because you have white privilege, I could see why you might think that's boring. But the point is, you need to have these symbols given to people. And for whatever reason, the teaching profession as a profession has just said, we're going to do away with rote memorization. Now, obviously, when you're in university getting a PhD, you need to move beyond rote memorization. But that's how you get there, right? Before you put a rocket ship into space, you still need to learn basic mathematics before you can deal with all the higher level calculations. And this is just something that is not being done. And I don't even remember what mealy-mouthed liberal excuse they were giving back in the day. But I thought to myself, this is crazy. How in the world how are you supposed to have students that can do history, i.e. read an account, interact with that account, make judgments about, say, conflicting narratives on a historical event, right? Let's say one side writes one thing, another side writes another. They're both observing a real event, so there's some truth in what both sides are saying. But how do you figure out which one's more right? Well, you have to know the historical events in the first place. Now, part of this is it gives the teachers the advantage of manipulating students. If they don't have these symbols already given to them at an earlier stage in their education, then you can just say whatever you want, and they won't be able to challenge you because they don't know any better. But you could say this is a pre-education, right? If education is thinking correctly, thinking about what? Well, the content that you think about has to be given to you before you start thinking. So it's kind of a pre-educational thing. And it's just not there. Now, I think you could say it's partly on purpose. But this is a crucial failure. And this is why there's so much remediation at every level of higher education. Because as students get further and further along, the professors and teachers at these higher levels of education are like, wow, you didn't learn this? And, this is this downstream from the disaster of not using rote memorization. Because it's funny, that was considered, authoritarian and mind control, which is exactly what we have now with this like Skinner-esque operant conditioning, right? That's the authoritarian mind control, not, a school mom with a ruler in a one-room schoolhouse teaching you to memorize your times tables. I mean, give me a break. Keith.
Yeah, as far as the rote memorization and the times tables and all of that, I know some years back I had in one of my lines of work, I had a college student I was dealing with that didn't know what the times tables were. And I was explaining to this student, I was saying, well, when you were in elementary school, did you have to learn the times tables? Like 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 4 is 16. They had no clue as to what I was talking about, and they could barely do this math. They knew if you had 2 of something and added 2 more, you had 4, but they weren't. Their mathematical skills were limited, even when it came to basic elementary school level math. And I do think that reflects the overall dumbing down of education, the way that I mentioned earlier. And another important point, though, is that this is not just an ideological problem. And it's not just a business model problem either. Like, I hear a lot of critics of education say, well, the problem with education is that it's too ideologically oriented towards the woke, politically correct people. And some of it is. In some educational institutions, you do see a bias in that kind of ideological direction. But a lot of times, the proposed solution is they just want to have something that's ideologically biased in some other way. They'll say, well, instead of teaching about how awful slavery was, we ought to teach about, how great the founders of the United States were, or what good fighters American troops were in World War II, or something like that. Something that's more ideological in some other way. But none of that resolves the problem of critical thinking. Whether you're reading about how badly slaves were mistreated, or whether you're reading about how great George Washington was, or whatever, none of that teaches critical thinking. That's one thing, and also the business model issue. I hear a lot of people say, "Well, the problem is public schools are run by incompetent people, so we need to have more private schools, or we need to have school vouchers to go to charter schools." But I encounter the same kinds of things in private schools, and from and in religious schools. I've dealt with students that went to private religious schools, that went to charter schools, and other non-religious private schools. Many of them have exactly the same issues. The Also at the university level, it's even more of a problem. In my professional work, I deal with students that go to state universities, to private universities, to community colleges, to HBCUs, to these online schools, these University of Phoenix and Strayer and all that kind of stuff. I deal with students who go to the private religious colleges, like the Liberty University type schools, and this exists everywhere. It's the educational model that's being used. It's not just about the type of school that it is in terms of its business model. You could say they all have the same business model, because they're all about collecting student loan money for the most part. But the way that education is done, it's just the dominant paradigm in education that cuts across institutions and ideologies, is one where, like, I know Todd is big on the idea of classical education. Most of these students would not have a clue as to what classical education is. Like, if you asked a lot of these students, did you have a classical education? They're like, what? What's that? It's like, and that I think is the root of the problem, is that the way that the students are being taught is terrible. They're not being taught anything. Not only are they not using rote memorization, like learning the times tables, they're not learning how to develop the use of logic and critical thinking skills. They're just being taught stuff that's really just middle school and high school level material at the university level. A lot of it is just basic training on a bare bones level, professional level, and some of it is not even that. A common method of education now is you use online distance education, or distance. It used to be called distance learning. Now it's just basically just online. So you have students that sign up for online classes, and their classes basically amount to participating in discussion boards. So it's basically like education by Facebook, as I said earlier. That's what it amounts to. And there's absolutely no critical thinking involved at all. It's something you can do easily with ChatGPT and stuff like that. So somebody who's getting an education that way is not going to know anything. And I see that among students. Like, I can ask students questions about the most simple, humanities fields related topics. Things you would think they should know. Like whether they're Protestant or not. They have no clue. But then they can engage in lengthy, drawn-out conversations about sports teams, about entertainers, and the all the drama associated with the Kardashian family. They know all about that stuff. So it's not that they can't absorb information. It's just the kind of information they're getting is worthless.
Yes. Now, we do have a super chat I want to get to right now from Log of the West for $19.99. Thank you very much. For the group, please see my previous note. So we're going to scroll up here, and he says, I'm in a constant battle against my children's teachers. The teachers are very happy to embrace an illiterate approach. My children's music teacher is using videos rather than sheet music. Well, yeah, that sort of is a highlight for our discussions today. Alek.
Yes. So I'm going to drive one specific point home as to why, in the absence of classical education, there is no real education. And I'm going to highlight two specific experiences that led me to start academic composition. Well, the first experience I had was in chemistry, where I had to memorize the table of elements, and my teacher failed me in my 10th grade because I didn't memorize everything, and I could not solve any problems because I did not memorize. I did not do the rote learning. And as Keith says, well, learning is the manipulation of symbols. How do we get the symbols? That's one thing. But he could have actually allowed students to begin learning the basic logic of chemistry, the basic ideas and concepts, without necessarily memorizing them. Most professional scientists and professors of STEM fields, as Florian may attest, may prioritize abstract thinking and critical thinking over the rote learning. And then a year later, I got a simple job at a fast food restaurant where I've seen the same thing in Jimmy John's. That you've got to memorize some ingredients and you follow the cookbook and you produce a product. Following the rules, very little foresight, very little insight, no critical thinking whatsoever, period. That's education. Working in McDonald's and being an A student in chemistry are not all that different. And then what began to change? Well, when I went to the university, I noticed that the emphasis was a little less on rote learning and more on critical thinking, some abstract thinking, but I'm one of the lucky few. And then I realized that to do what we do at academic composition, you can't be a rote learner. You've got to be an abstract thinker. And that's only something you can learn on your own. But where do you find that kind of guidance? Where is that kind of education available? And that truly defeats the whole point of education itself. That if one truly learns to think critically, they need to do it on their own initiative. They need to be thinking outside of the box. That maybe they can be educated on this podcast. Maybe they can use ChatGPT on their own. And then the question is, can they truly learn? Do they have an IQ that's high enough? And if they do not, well, the system of education will not help. So I would go so far as to say that the system of education fundamentally is not promoting anything that we know to be classical education in any way at all. That it's meant to be indoctrination, it's meant to be conditioning students to act like people in John Searle's Chinese room experiment, to be parroting and pantomiming ideas that the educator says are acceptable without actually processing them, because the system of education penalizes one for thinking outside of the box in any way at all. So that to me is the most fundamental critique of education itself. We're rewarding specific behaviors that you can learn by pantomiming people and aping them. In that case, what is it good for? Well, what purpose does it serve?
Yeah, well, control, I would say, but Florian.
Yeah, control is a good point. That's certainly one point. I just want to circle back a little bit on the rote memorization stuff. Why that came up is I think especially after 1945 and during the 1968 times and so on, teachers didn't want to do rote memorization because I think they didn't want to engage in nation-building narratives where like some heroes conquered that tribe and then they built this great nation. And they felt like that would neglect minority narratives and stuff like that, right? And then you have people like Piaget and other constructivists. They basically argue that students need to engage with history in an active manner, and it doesn't help if you just sit there and get fed some some data. That's actually what my mother told me. She said like she never really knew what history means when she got to learn those dates, and there was nothing else to it. And she said she had one teacher who basically put the students back into the world, on the 4th century after Christ. What was living back then? What did living back then mean? And so all of a sudden, those dates had more of a meaning for students. I think, I know, especially after the greatest generation coming back from fighting World War II. I wasn't there, but I would wager a guess that they probably had a very clear black and white mindset, how to explain the world. And then you had the Korean War, you had the nuclear scare, the Cold War starting to ramp up, and then a lot of these people that are in favor of abandoning rote memorization, they were then expected to go to Vietnam, and all that, everything that was, and that led to everything that was back then a very solid part of education to be kind of at least questioned, right? Because people felt like they just have to learn dates to become like a robot, basically, as well. That's how the backlash against rote memorization started. I think, of course, you need you need to have both, right? You need to have critical thinking and the dates, and they get you there if you know the dates. But that was something people rejected there because they thought it's a dead narrative. I think that's the reason why it came up. But we now have AI, so maybe we can have curricula that use AI in the way that, you had these Facebook glasses. Maybe you have more glass in the future, where some other immersive technology where the students can sit and then they're put back into the medieval ages, a little bit like a computer game, right? And then they relive what people what certain they relive certain historical events, and
Oregon
then all of a
Trail,
sudden,
Florian, Oregon Trail, right?
Oregon Trail, yes, Oregon Trail. That's more of. Do they have it as an AI version, like with full immersion? I think,
Well,
but
it's the same idea though, just simpler, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I bet you that most students could be able to retell historical narratives if they played them in some computer games and so on. So if we can get something like that, maybe that would be a solution. I also remember Bill and Ted's Incredible Journey. Those are 3 movies, I think, with Keanu Reeves and Alex Winter, where they're close to failing history exam, and then the time machine comes along, and they're put back into time, and their plan is to take all those important figures like Genghis Khan and some other people back in that time machine and present them for the final presentation. That's a pretty cool movie, and maybe something like that, but in terms of AI, we can recreate that. And that would, I'm not even joking here, that maybe a good way to use AI for future education.
Well, all right. As we wrap up the show, I'll start with my final thoughts. Ultimately, it's the students that have been failed. It's a poor teacher that blames the student. It's not their fault. The fact that they are struggling as late as college and university. But then, second of all, since the teachers have failed them, what's the best thing they can do right now? Well, it's not ideal, but there's plenty of content on YouTube that you can learn yourself, both practical, like how to do things with your hands, and then also things like history and science. And you can use AI tools as a surrogate teacher to talk to. Again, this is just where you're at right now today. You can do those two things, and that's a way to start doing remediation on your own side. Because ultimately, you can't rely on other people to do this. They're not doing it for you, so you're going to have to start doing it yourself. And if you don't know where to start, those are some places you can start. Final thoughts, Keith?
Yeah, I think that for education to be really improved, it's the model of education is going to have to be totally revamped. And whether that's done in, what the institutional setting is really a secondary issue. Like whether it's in public schools, private schools, charter schools, church schools, home schools, whether it's in, public or private universities or community colleges or, online education or whatever, there needs to be a reassessment of, first of all, what is the actual purpose of education? Why are we doing this in the first place? And what is going to be the model for producing the best possible outcome in terms of, not only things like basic literacy and basic knowledge of history and science and mathematical skills, but also practical life skills. Like, I know one of the best classes I had in high school, and this was at a private school, was called business math, where it was all about, how to do things you needed to know to manage your own finances and that kind of stuff in your day-to-day life. How to, people don't really use paper checks that much anymore, but it was about like how to write a paper check or how to balance a checkbook, or again, that's not the, some of the technology is outdated, but it was basically applying mathematics to practical life skills. You don't see that much of that anymore. At the university level, I think that there needs to be more emphasis on things like critical thinking. Like, one of the prerequisite classes should be critical thinking skills, and as well as things like reading and study skills, just how to read. I mean, a lot of university students need remedial reading training. Um, they need to know what it means to have study skills. So, but the problem is, though, I don't see any interest anywhere in society in reforming the educational system. I keep seeing a lot of data showing that the quality of American education continues to go down. Like, increasingly, the United States falls behind many other countries in terms of overall literacy rates and ability, aptitude of students for different subjects and things like that. And you hear people complaining about it, but I think that they don't really have any interest in reforming the actual institutional model of how education is delivered. Instead, they want to criticize the business model. They'll say, well, you shouldn't have student loan debt. Education should be free. Yeah, but whether it's free or not, if the quality sucks, then it's still going to suck. Or well, we need to teach less wokeism and more, patriotism or something else. Yeah, but if you can shift the ideological framework and still have the education be low quality, or the business model. Well, we need to send. We need to have a voucher system so students can go to different schools or have wider school choice. Yeah, but if you're choosing between crummy schools, you're still going to get a crummy education. So I think that's the real problem. It's the way education is delivered. It's the actual model of education that's being used that's the problem. These other things are problems too, but this is the first problem.
Okay, final thoughts, Alek.
Well, I have a new suggestion for education that's actually clear and simple. Just as machines pass through litmus test, the Turing test, can a machine act like a human? Then that's a quality machine. Well, the purpose of education is to teach you to do something that a machine cannot do. I think classical education, such as logical analysis, critical thinking, and the ability to discuss complex ideas, is the key requirement for that. Can you do something that a machine cannot do? Well, what does that mean? Well, possibly, can you have a complex discussion in a foreign language? Can you deal with a situation that one cannot solve with ChatGPT? Can you actually figure something out without step-by-step instructions, without having a cookbook, what have you? Then it is worth learning. And that's what education should be about. Teaching people to do, or at least inspire them to do something that one cannot do with machine-like precision, with specific instructions. And what we do at Academic Composition is when a customer comes to us, what we ask them for is a document of instructions. How many pages do you need? What have you? What are the questions to answer? And what's the rubric? A, B, and C. But that defeats the whole point of education. To be truly, for one to have a truly educational experience, they must be able to do something without any instructions. And as you say, Todd, control is the purpose of education. Yes, it is. Horace Mann would have thought the same. And that's why John Taylor Gatto says that he teaches confusion. Nothing more.
All right.
So that's so maybe this is the strongest possible case for homeschooling, but that depends on who should be qualified to homeschool, who should be given out licenses. The state, I doubt it. The church, I also doubt it. So that's a critical question. Where on the earth does one get the authorization to be homeschooling people?
All right, you get the last word, Florian.
All right. I like to refer a little bit back to Alex when it comes to homeschooling. I think homeschooling pods are a great model, and I'm not a homeschooler, so but what I learned about pods is basically are smaller groups of students that are gathering together, and then you do homeschooling. Homeschooling doesn't mean that your parents teach you at the kitchen table and that's it. No, no, no. Like the neighbors or friends come together and they teach their kids together. What they do, homeschooling curricula or homeschooling methods, they force kids to engage with the stuff, and they also follow actually what John Taylor Gatto said, to have kids learn on their own pace. Like what I read from homeschooling kids is that they're regularly much faster than they would be in school. So basically, they're 2 years ahead of their peers who go to public school or even private school, right? Um, but also Keith said that we still have to think why we do education, what we do it for, right? And day-to-day life skills are a very important part. I think that's really great. Applying math to practical life skills. I would integrate like home working. I think there's a specific word I forgot. Basically, teach children how to repair a car, and maybe do some carpentry, repair some hole in the wall at home, stuff like that, right? Maybe be able to wire a simple electric circuit and stuff like that. I think also teaching students critical thinking. I think education system is not changing, at least not in the foreseeable future. What happens is that people are just extracting themselves from the system and start homeschooling, and maybe that way we get over time a different education system that will grow, that will start with people extracting themselves from the system as it's now, and then you have a parallel system that grows and maybe at one point replaces the public education system that we now have.
All right. Well, thank you, Keith, Alek, and Florian. It's always a pleasure having you guys on. This is Todd Lewis of the President Folly Podcast, signing off.